My first reaction was, why me? There were 250 IAS officers in the state. They could have chosen anyone, but they picked on me. I had shown no flair for any project like this, much less for bottling liquor. Even as the stalemate was unresolved, Department of Telecom went ahead and gave away licenses. And there were some irregularities or alleged irregularities in the licensing process that became the subject matter of a criminal case. Ministry of Finance was not part of that. I'm not talking about that story.
First and foremost, welcome, sir. Welcome to Asia. And this is the book for everybody who's watching it right now, but is going to be watching it later. As you can see, it's a pretty well-thumbed copy. And it's very rare that it's not a memoir, and it's not exactly a dry book about how to be a central bank governor. It's somewhere between the two. And it's also, the subtitle is very interesting, Life and Career, but it's notes. And that's how it kind of comes across. Before we get into the long discussion, which of course is going to be about the state, finances, RBI, so on and so forth, I'm going to begin with, because a lot of people who are going to be watching it and who are watching it are going to be young students. You were in the IIT, you were studying physics, and at that point of time, you write in your book that everybody in your class wanted to go to the United States or some other place, and it was not really a lot of IITians' cup of tea or interest to be in the Indian administration at all, or in the Indian foreign services. At that point of time, what is the mental framework that we should be using when you reflect back on your time as a student, for all the students who are going to be listening to it? How do you make decisions where everything today is based on the quality of a career, which comes in with a halo? So what is the advice that you would give to students on how to make decisions in a complicated and a complex world?
It will be very presumptuous on my part to give advice to students, much less advice on how to make choices. But as somebody said, my book can be seen in several ways. In fact, I didn't have an overarching theme when I wrote the book, but several reviewers put a theme around it. And one of the reviewers actually said, this book is about making choices, making choices between life and career, work and family, between one career option and another. And when you're confronted with a difficult situation, how do you follow your Dharma? This is all about making choices. So it's very appropriate that you're starting this conversation with making choices. But since you asked this question in the context of the IIT, in the IIT framework, you look at all the choices available to you and say, what is the choice that best maximizes collective good? And that's the way you make choices. Sometimes it might be very intensely personal choice, but it still has a public implication. Just to give you an example, when I qualified for the IAS, I had an option to choose between the Foreign Service and the IAS. So I had to make a choice. And I made a choice in consultation or at the exhortation of my father. But at the back of my mind, there was also this question of what is best collectively for me to do. So I don't think there is a template or an algorithm for making a choice, but I would say that whenever you're confronted with a choice, follow your Dharma.
Thank you. I hope that makes life easy for a lot of students who are going to be getting this advice. And but it's an interesting thing, and Dharma is something that we're going to get back later in the conversation as well. But before we get into that, let's start with what I found to be a very interesting note that you have. about the importance of gazetteers. And I actually went in and looked. Today, even today, when we are thinking about information about small Mofussil towns or districts, we don't really have a lot of condensed information which is available to local administrators, and not just the ones that have been appointed from the union government, which is the IAS officers, but also the one from the state offices. So when you were starting out and the information was, very spread out, was there a specific mental framework that helped you take quick decisions? Because taking quick decisions and kind of gliding through different people's problem is a hallmark of this particular book. So how do we think about information processing today, or how would you think about it?
Can you please be more specific? Like,
So, right. So, for example, when you talk about, say, the Naxal movement, and there is a specific thing when you are talking about in terms of land. So, you write in your book that at that point of time, the first step that you took was to try and solve it at the individual level. But then you went out and then you realized that perhaps that is not the best way of dealing with it. Today, if somebody takes that experimental approach to thinking and information processing, it might impact them negatively. So how do we think about experiments and taking quick decisions?
Yeah, thank you for putting that question in a very specific context. What I wrote in my book was my early experience as the sub-collector of Parvatipuram, because when you're a frontline administrator, a lot of people come to you with their grievances, problems, etc., hoping that you can solve them because you are the face of the government. In some sense, you are their savior, more than the government. They look up to you. People come to you with their land problems, with their villas problems, with problems about public services, problems about livelihood. I had problems with women coming to me and telling me that husbands are drinking too much and whether I can protect them, whether I can stop their husbands from drinking. Now, you can't solve many of these problems. Okay? But initially, I thought, okay, I've been taught to listen patiently to people. Listening itself is half the solution. So I will listen to them patiently. Then I realized after about 3 to 4 months of this is that I'm not being very efficient. I'm not being very effective. Just by listening to people and not being able to solve the problems. So I thought if my endeavor has to be to solve the maximum number of problems for the maximum number of people, maximizing utility as it were, trying to solve retail grievances is not the most effective way. I must take a more comprehensive approach. For example, there might be a few people who have been driven out of their land. Do I go and address their problems, spend a lot of time on their specific problem? Or do I launch a big program overall to see that most people who've been assigned land have actually got possession of the land? So I found that if I apply the 80-20 formula, the maximum utility, maximization of utility, it is better not to get into the retail level when your success rate is low, but try to solve problems comprehensively. Just let me add another thought to this. We have a new chief minister in the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh. I live in Hyderabad, I'm in Telangana, but in the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh, we have a new chief minister. Yesterday, I saw in the newspaper a photograph of the chief minister saying that every morning from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock is going to meet the public and listen to the grievances. And this is a very senior politician, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, has been in politics for nearly 50 years. He's been chief minister for 15 years. He knows the futility of doing this. A chief minister cannot efficiently be handling people's grievances at a personal level. But as a political leader, he made a calculation that I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to do this because it's going to get me a lot of political mileage, even if I may not be able to solve the problem. But as an administrator, you are fortunately devoid of the political dimension. So you try to maximize your effectiveness by trying to address problems at a systemic level rather than at the retail level. That's how I approached my frontline administration in the early years.
Thank you, Professor. Uh, there are many instances that can be picked up from the early part of the career. And I think a few interviews have spoken to you about it. I'm personally going to go back to it because I really found that fascinating. You spent a year under Chief Minister NTR as the officer on special duty for, and I cannot believe I'm going to be saying it out loud, AREC bottling.
Right.
Fascinating. I really love that bit of the book. But here are two questions that come up. A, chief ministers then, and perhaps chief ministers now, if not at a more senior level, that particular scheme did not go through any process of evaluation. It was something that the chief minister wanted to do, because of course it's a problem and that has to be addressed, but there was no review. It just came out and you were given the responsibility of seeing it through. What is the role then of a bureaucrat, and how much role does a bureaucrat have in actually advising the chief minister to say that perhaps this might not be the optimal usage of time? So A, take us through that particular incident, because I think it would be a fascinating case study of how decisions are made.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. As you said, this came up in every interaction I had about my book. I'm talking about the mid 1980s when I put in about just over 10 years of service. Mr. N.T. Ramarao, NTR, who was a famous film actor, became our chief minister. NTR was not only a teetotaler, but he had moral contempt for people who drank. And he was pained by thousands of people who were dying because of drinking illicit, adulterated liquor. So he wanted to stop that. And he wanted to impose total prohibition. The finance department and senior government officials, I was not senior enough then to be in that position to advise him, it told him that that cannot be done because if we impose total prohibition, the state will lose a huge amount of revenue. And if we lose that much of revenue, the government cannot implement some of the flagship schemes of NTR, such as giving people rice at rupees 2. Then NTR said, what is the second best solution? People said the second best solution, presumably I'm reconstructing what must have happened in that meeting because I was not present there. He was advised that the second best solution is to set up a bottling plant for bottling liquor in every district of the state so that the government would supply liquor in sealed bottles and people who were drinking, who were buying drink, would know that this is clean liquor and they would be prevented from drinking adulterated liquor. So it went through some sort of a processing, not a very nitty-gritty, deeply analytical examination that you have in mind, Amok, but it did go through processing. And then it was decided that the government would actually go ahead with that. The costing, the detailing, time framing was all left to me afterwards. But the government suddenly decided that we must implement this. And there were just 9 months of time. They said, we're going to implement it. And they picked me from nowhere as officer on special duty for AREC bottling. I don't know if they use that word across the country, but AREC is the name for country liquor in Andhra Pradesh. So I was officer on special duty for AREC bottling. My first reaction was, why me? There were 250 IAS officers in the state. They could have chosen anyone, but they picked on me. I had shown no flair for any project like this, much less for bottling liquor. And this was a no-go project. It couldn't be done in 9 months. I thought I was being set up for failure. And what do? When you join the IAS, you want to change the world. These days, you see interviews of IAS toppers. When newspaper, media people interview them, why do you want to join the IAS? I want to change the world. So here I joined the IAS, and where do you go to a family function, your wedding or an event or a party, and people say, what are you doing? I'm bottling liquor. I'm trying to change the world by bottling liquor. So it was so embarrassing. I was distraught, angry, annoyed, frustrated. And I brooded for about 3-4 days. But then I said, if this is something that I have to do, I will do it regardless. If I fail, that's it. It's better to have tried and failed than not trying at all. So I got together a team, and then we implemented the project and completed it 3 days before the D-Day. Fully machined, fully commissioned, fully staffed, all systems in place, ready to switch. Okay, so I learned a lot of lessons from that experience. But your question is about, do officials advise the chief minister? I believe there was some advice given to him on this, although it is not done strictly in the sense of taking a pen and paper, taking the cost benefit calculus, and then this is what needs to be done, because most public policy decisions are not amenable to strictly numerical cost benefit calculus unless you make heroic assumptions. And in a project like this, it looked quite self-evident that if you cannot impose total prohibition, this is the second best option. Although looking back, I'm sure that some of the things that you're talking about we should have done.
Thank you, sir, for that. So I'm going to, as I said, there are many things that I can pick up from the early part of your career, but I'm going to bring this early part to the conclusion by asking you a reflective question. In your book, there is a very good section where you go back to the first place that you were placed as, and as an IAS officer, and you were fondly welcomed by Miss Bhumika, if I remember correctly from the book, who was then serving in your Bhavna. I'm sorry, Miss Bhavna, who was serving in your stead, and you went in, I think, by bus, and train, bus, and then so on and so forth. And I think you walked that particular stretch. 50 years, give and take, that you've been part of the Indian Administrative Services. What specifically has changed in your services? Because people who are part of the IAS take it very seriously. Services are something that they are really fond of, the time that they've spent. So what has changed in the IAS? And second, we live in a very complicated world. And the reason I've been asking you these questions about information processing is because you've done a lot of things, but after that, you've been part of academia. You're also teaching, if I'm not wrong, at the Cooperative School of Public Policy, which I think is great because you're trying to shape up public policy leaders of tomorrow. So how does an IAS officer today, especially in all of the information and everything that they have to do, how do they approach day-to-day administration? Because the world has become very, very complicated. So a reflective question for you.
Yeah. First thing you asked about what's changed in the IAS, how is the IAS different, or how is the job approach to administration different today?
Yes.
So let me circumscribe the question by saying that I'm going to talk about the early part of an IAS career at the field level. Let's not talk about the entire IAS career because that will make it very wide canvas. But let's talk about the first 10 to 15 years of a typical IAS career, which is spent at the field level, at the front end, and people-facing jobs mostly, right? So as you said, I was sub-collector Parvatipuram from 1974 to 76. So in 2022, I went back there. I had not gone back there in 46, 47 years. It was a wonderful experience. I had gone there with some misgivings because when you go on a nostalgia trip, there is a risk that all these beautiful images that you have, all the enchanting images, experiences that you have in mind, there's a risk that they'll be shattered. But nevertheless, I went on that nostalgia trip, and it was a very fulfilling experience, both by the physical landscape changes that I saw, as well as in the administration. But since your question is about the IAS, let me focus on that. I asked Bhavna, just as some senior officer who trained me asked me when he came to my subdivision, he asked me, Subba, how many days in a week do you travel out? How many nights in a week do you sleep out? So I asked Bhavna, how much do you travel? How many days a week do you spend, go traveling? And how many nights out do you do? She said, what's the need for that, sir? I have the telephone, I have the internet, I have the video conferencing, I get to know everything, I can monitor what's happening everywhere. So, what's the need for that? So, I was a bit taken aback by that response because I thought the USP of an IAS officer, or indeed of civil services at the front end, is the exposure to the public, trying to understand, go and meet people, go to villages, experience, see their problems, listen to them, and therefore enrich your own understanding in order to solve their problems. In some sense, Bhavana was right, because what has changed between 50 years ago and today is that poverty levels are lower today, awareness levels are higher, demand for accountability is higher. Therefore, accent of early career IAS officers has shifted from poverty reduction to service delivery. Second, because people are more aware, more literate, there is greater demand for accountability, which is not there in my time. Third, you know, 50 years ago, 45 years ago, 40 years ago, I found that most of the district level politicians were not highly educated. They had just finished school, but they were intelligent people, aware people, but they were not educated in a formal sense. So typically, civil servants, particularly IAS officers, were better educated than district level politicians, and there was some smug superiority complex used to be there. But today, many district level politicians rival civil servants in terms of the quality of education, in terms of levels of education. So those are all many changes that have come about. And most importantly, technology has come in today. There is internet, there is the telephone, there is video conferencing. So lots of things have changed in terms of the logistics of administration and the challenges of administration. What has not changed is the commitment that civil servants must have to the larger public good. And second thing, from my own point of view, is the need for civil servants to go out into the field and dirty their hands, regardless of all the technology they have. They need to go and expose themselves, dirty their hands, indeed dirty their bodies, but going to the villages and talking to people, interacting with them, and understanding their problems.
Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot the second question. You asked the second question, which I lost track of.
That's absolutely fine, sir. What I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the question I asked with something that you've just said.
Right.
You said something very specific about service delivery. That's one of the newer mandates of the IAS officers from poverty alleviation. So let me take you back to 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong. You wrote an op-ed in a major Indian newspaper where you demanded or suggested that the IAS perhaps needs an overhaul. First thing I wanted to understand, when you say the IAS, you mean the praxis of the entire civil services, or is it just specifically the IAS? Do you also mean the revenue service and the foreign service and then, so on and so forth? Or is it just the administrative services? That's my question one. Question two, you had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Karan Thapar on that particular op-ed. And I'm going to be not quoting you directly from it, but I'm going to be paraphrasing. You compared the Indian administrators to the UK civil service, and you found the Indian administrative services slightly lacking because of the sheer focus on delivering quantitative services rather than quality. So perhaps there's a chance of mediocrity increasing in the services. When we look at the IAS system from outside, I'm not a member of the services, but when I look at it, I find that perhaps the administration is bogged down by too many consultants. So when you say that the officer has to go out, there are now consultants who do this. And the government has been trying for some time. I think there is something called as the Mission Karmyogi, if I'm not wrong, which wants to upskill not just the IAS, but everybody who's in the public services delivery. But it's not really happening. So A, your reflections on it, but B, how would we go about it? How do you transform an elephantine institution such as the IAS?
Yeah. Thank you, Amol. There's a lot of questions. In fact, I can spend the rest of this conversation responding.
I'm extremely sorry for that.
No, but let me be as specific as possible. First, you referred to an op-ed that I wrote a couple of years ago in a major newspaper. It's actually titled, "Has the IAS Failed the Nation?" My binary answer to that question was yes, but then in the rest of the opinion piece, I go to nuance that, saying in what sense the IAS has declined in a moral and in intellectual sense. So some of what I said might apply to all civil services, but I largely focused on the IAS because I'm more familiar with it. I'm a member of that service. I thought I had the liberty to talk about that service more than other services. But I spoke specifically about the IAS because the IAS is also unique, perhaps a little bit with the IPS, because these are people-facing services, public-facing services, unlike the revenue service. The revenue service also deals with the public, but in a different way. You know, the IAS and IPS, particularly the IAS, deals with public in the raw sense of, like I said, going to the villages, etc. So that op-ed piece was specifically, if you would like to say, in the context of the IAS, and I said the IAS has fallen intellectually and morally, and lots of things need to be done. The second question you asked about is about going back to my interview with Karan Thapar, but since you raised that, I just want to say the comparison that you raised. Go throw your mind back to 2 years ago when Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, was under investigation for a Partygate affair, if you recall, by the British equivalent of our cabinet secretary and our Delhi police. Okay. Now, nobody in the UK, not the public, not the members of the parliament, nobody found fault with who was appointed to inquire into it. No, they might have found fault with, they had politics around it, but nobody said, how can these people inquire into it? Can you imagine in our system, the cabinet secretary and the Delhi police being appointed to investigate some misdemeanor or some wrongdoing, alleged misdemeanor on the part of the prime minister? No, the service does not command that sort of credibility. Okay? So that's what I was referring to. That the British civil service, all said and done, still enjoys that credibility, which the IAS does not. Your third question was about mediocrity. I wrote also in that opinion piece, among other things, one of the maladies of the IAS is that it promotes mediocrity, in the sense that, those of you who are familiar with the game of tennis, there is people who play winners to win the game, and there are people who try to minimize unforced errors. So you can do an IAS job trying to score winners, or you can do an IAS job trying to minimize your unforced errors. But ultimately, public good, I believe, is served by scoring winners, trying, experimenting, being innovative, trying to do new things, trying to do better, knowing full well that they might be failures. But most IAS officers find that when they try to take that approach, they're not recognized. In fact, they find that they lose out in the process. So they fall back to the other extreme of minimizing unforced errors. Okay? So they fall into mediocrity because they find that mediocrity is what the IAS demands is mediocrity. So that's what I said, that the IAS has fallen into this groove of a perception that to win in the rat race of the service, you adopt the mediocrity approach. Okay. Now, the last thing you talked about is something more, much deeper. I wish I can explain that. It's not, you talked about a mission. What's that mission you talked about, Amol, about training civil servants?
Mission Karma Yogi.
Yeah,
Mission Karma.
Mission Karma Yogi. Now, all these training programs, all these missions are very good. They're necessary. They're necessary to improve the skills, improve the personality, improve the capability of IAS officers, indeed of all civil servants, to do better. Okay, that's necessary. I'm not saying anything about that, but that is not sufficient. Okay, and it is the sufficiency question that I come to, because every individual, every human being has a personality and a character. We tend to conflate them. We tend to conflate personality and character without trying to distinguish between them. In our children in schools, our students in colleges, in universities, in jobs, its all accent is on promoting personality, improving personality. I believe that's what Mission Karma Yoga is about. But character is equally important, if not more important. That cannot be taught. That cannot be trained. It's got to come with values. And that's more important. That's equally, if not more important, for all civil services and for the IAS too. And that's where the accent should be. Promoting a value system, encouraging people with character. I think that's very, very important.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for that. Okay, so I'm going to keep on asking you these meta questions, but after I ask a meta question, I have to come back to just a mercenary. So now I'm back to the book. You write as a note about the 1996 moment of crisis in our democracy, where there was a lot of political misadjustment. There was not a clear government being formed, and everybody was out to get the betterment for their state. And you write about Jyoti Basu, who suggested to everybody else that perhaps we should be looking at the model of cooperative federalism. And you hold him, in this particular instance, you hold him in a high regard for this. I would want you to kind of think about cooperative federalism right now, because it seems to be slightly under a crisis of its own. I think the last time one could argue that this was done well was the 2016 moment of the introduction of the GST, when the then finance minister, Mr. Jaitley, could get the states along and could carry them along. But without cooperative federalism, the development of this country will suffer. So what are your reflections about cooperative federalism from all the lenses that you've served the government of India and also beyond that?
Yeah, again, that's a very, very meta question, but let me address it as specifically as I can. India has made many transitions in the last 75 years of independence. And one of the important transitions we made is transitioning from a docile federalism to cooperative federalism to today to a confrontational federalism. And I'm not saying this is necessarily bad. It can see it as a positive reflection, positive development. But that's what it is today. And before I reflect on that question, you must give me 2 minutes to give that little story about Jyoti Basu to set the context for this. Now,
absolutely.
This is a story of mid-1990s, actually late 90s, when Deva Gowda had become the prime minister, and many older people of my cohort, my generation, will recall that Deva Gowda had become prime minister with the support of chief ministers. So chief ministers, after installing him as the prime minister, started demanding their pound of flesh. They wanted more money. And Deva Gowda had no money to give, no way of giving, because the Finance Commission had given its award. And it's not possible for the prime minister to just say that I'm giving more money to the states. So he did what any prime minister would do, particularly a seasoned politician like him. He appointed a committee. So a committee under the chairmanship of then Home Minister Indrajit Gupta, with the Finance Minister Chidambaram, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission Pranab Mukherjee as members, and with about a dozen chief ministers. to try and find out or agree on how much of the taxes that the center collects, what proportion must be given to the states, to get a broad agreement on that. Now, chief ministers, wherever chief ministers talk, they're talking to their constituencies. So they up their demand, that sky was the limit. So people said, why does the central government need any money at all? They must collect taxes and distribute it across the states. So they said the center must keep only 10%, give away 90%. Then, very strident demands. So this committee went on through several meetings. Unlike any government committee, it went from one committee to subcommittees to subcommittees, etc. And chief ministers continued to make the strident demand about how the central government must give away more money to the states. And this is across political lines, chief ministers of all political parties. So when this went on for about 6 months, there was a final meeting on Saturday afternoon in Vignan Bhavan. And the committee members, Mr. Indrajit Gupta, Pranab Mukherjee, Chidambaram, some union ministers, then a dozen chief ministers, and a whole lot of officials. There were about 250 of us in that room. Final meeting, and meeting went all over the map, as you would think it would happen. Chief ministers again made very strident demand, 90%, 80%, whatever. We were seeing no conclusion to it. After this went on for about 3.5 hours, Indrajit Gupta got exasperated. So he made a very fervent appeal to chief ministers. He said, we've heard you, but we also have a problem. We need money for government of India. We need money for defense, for national security. So please keep the national perspective in view when you make your demands. Slowly, over the next 10 minutes, a consensus emerged. One chief minister after another fell in line. Ultimately, they all agreed that we will ask for 50%, that central government must give away 50% of the revenues to the states. All chief ministers agreed to that, except the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh, who happened to be Mr. Chandrababu Naidu at that time. I was present at that meeting, sitting next to him. He alone stood out. He wouldn't fall in line. He was looking at the roof, and there were 250 people looking at him. So for him to say yes, so that we could conclude the meeting. And he would not budge. So then Mr. Jyoti Basu got up. I just want you to make a mental picture of this conference room. It was a horseshoe table. We were all seated in alphabetical order. Andhra Pradesh, alphabetically first, was at one end of the horseshoe. And West Bengal, the alphabetically last, was at the other end of the horseshoe. So Jyoti Basu, Chief Minister of West Bengal, got up. Everybody thought he was going to the bathroom. But then he didn't go to the bathroom. He started walking along the hall, along the horseshoe, tripping over several toes. It took him about 2 minutes to come from West Bengal to Andhra Pradesh. And he arrived at Andhra Pradesh. I half got up to offer my chair to him because I was sitting next to my CM. He pushed me down with his hand on my shoulder. He put his other hand on Mr. Babu's shoulder, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, and he told him as if he was speaking person to person, but it was actually meant to be heard across the hall because there was pin drop silence. He said, Babu, we've all said our piece. We've all raised our demand, but the Home Minister, the Finance Minister are saying that there is a problem for the country. So there are times when we must take a nationalistic view. So please understand. And even before Mr. Chandrababu Naidu could answer, he turned back and started walking back towards West Bengal. And within 15 seconds after that, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu nodded and we had an agreement in place. It's a different matter that Devagowda government fell 2 weeks after that and nothing came of that meeting. But I'm telling you that story. The reason I'm recalling that story is to say that we need state level leaders who take a nationalistic view like that. And we need leaders at the national level who understand state level problems. What we do not need is leaders who speak depending on where they sit. They say one thing when they're chief ministers, they say another thing when they're ministers in the central cabinet. So there are issues, there are situations, there are contexts in which political leaders must think beyond their immediate position and take a nationalistic view. And that is what I believe should be cooperative, efficient federalism. And we are far from the best practice.
If I might get your comments on something that has been vexing me for some time. We've just gone through an election process, and there is a clear mandate, or at least the single largest party has enough members of parliament to form the government, and they have formed the government. We have the prime minister being sworn in for the third time. Some states, states such as Bihar and Andhra Pradesh, are thinking about demanding special status, or that's what the news tells us. We are not privy to inside information, but that's what the news tells us is the cost of joining the government, so on and so forth. For lay people, please walk us through the process. Can any prime minister effectively give a grant which is at odds with the finance commission?
I don't believe so. No, not generally. Okay. See, again, this is a very complex issue, but let me capture my response in a couple of minutes. Earlier, there used to be the Planning Commission and the Finance Commission. The Finance Commission is a constitutional body appointed every 5 years as per a constitutional mandate. The Finance Commission decides how much of what proportion of central taxes should be shared with the states and how they should be shared among the states. So they decide on two things: a vertical share, which is how much of the central taxes should be given away, and how that vertical share must be distributed horizontally across states. That is a formula that the Finance Commission decides. Earlier, the Planning Commission used to give also grants and loans to states according to what we traditionally, historically call the Gadgil formula, but subsequently it became the Gadgil-Mukherjee formula. But since the abolition of the Planning Commission, there is only one mechanism by which central government gives money to states, that is as per the recommendations of the Finance Commission. However, there are many hidden ways in which the center can give not so much hard cash, but can help states in a financial sense, oftentimes hidden. A clear example is national infrastructure, railways, for example. Yesterday, I live in Hyderabad in the state of Telangana. Yesterday, I saw in the Telangana Telugu newspaper that Telangana has been neglected by the central government historically in terms of railways. And they had an analysis of which state had how much of new lines laid since independence, how much Telangana got. So this is one way the central government can help, investing in infrastructure, investing in public sector, encouraging. If a foreign investor comes and says that, look, I want to invest $5 billion in this state, central government can say, look, don't go there, go here. That's another way central government can influence. So there are hidden, subtle ways in which the central government can transfer money to states or benefit states. There are also other ways. Take MSP, for example. This is very hidden, but very subtle, but very clear. Take the minimum support price that the government of India announces every year. They announce the minimum support price predominantly for rice and wheat. Now, if they raise the MSP, who benefits? If the government of India raises the MSP, people who benefit are farmers with a marketable surplus. Where are the farmers with marketable surplus of wheat and rice? Only in select states of the country. So if the government of India raises MSP for wheat and rice, certain states are benefiting at the expense of other states. They don't even realize, but there is a hidden transfer going on. So the answer to your question is, on the face of it, directly transfers take place according to the formula given by the Finance Commission. However, there are many hidden ways, many subtle ways in which the central government can aid states, and much of it is oftentimes informed by political considerations. But to the best of my knowledge, it is not possible for the prime ministers to call a cabinet meeting and say that, look, I've decided to give 5,000 crore to Andhra Pradesh because chief minister is supporting our coalition. I think that's not possible.
Right. I mean, because in the news, there is this expectation that there is something like this. As I said, we are not
No,
really
it
privy
is,
to what's going on.
I don't want to deny it possible. Tomorrow, the people will say Subbarao said it's not possible. It is possible, but there are mechanisms for it. Prime Minister has
Right.
to, get Parliament approval for it and has to make a special case for it. For example, in the case of Andhra Pradesh, the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, made a statement in the Parliament that Andhra Pradesh would be given special status. That is the basis on which Andhra Pradesh is demanding special status now. So it's possible to take that forward, but I'm saying that it cannot be done in an ad hoc manner.
Right. Right. So we now come to the part of the book that everybody is really excited about. Your tenure as the 22nd governor of the Reserve Bank of India. You were appointed in early September 2008 when you were in a flight back from Rio de Janeiro, having attended, I think, a G20 delegation or meeting. You must have had some sort of plans and other things that you wanted to do. But I think 15 September 2008, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Take us through this particular process. What happened and how do you reflect on it 16 years later?
Okay, that's a good story to tell, and I hope interesting. I became governor on the 5th of September 2008. 5th of September 2008 is a very significant date in the history of world finance. Not because I became governor, but because of events that took place in the 2 weeks following 5th of September 2008. 5th of September, I became governor. 7th of September, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two large housing mortgage companies in the US, were put under conservatorship. 9th of September, AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, came to the brink of a meltdown. 10th of September, Washington Mutual came to near meltdown. 13th of September, Merrill Lynch vanished. 14th of September, Countrywide, another large bank in the US, vanished. 15th of September, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Lehman Brothers, an investment bank, collapsed. The collapse of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September 2008 plunged the world into a deep financial crisis. The global financial system was plunged into a near-death experience. The global economy went into a downturn not seen since the Great Depression. Policymakers everywhere, governments, central banks, regulators, were bewildered, anxious, concerned about what needs to be done. Financial markets were gripped with fear and panic. Public everywhere were concerned, scared about where their money would be. There was a lot of fear, anger, scare, panic. That series of collapse of storied institutions culminating in Lehman Brothers collapse on the 15th of September ricocheted around the world and affected every country in the world. India too was affected. Our growth dived, the rupee became volatile, financial markets panicked. All our financial markets, our currency market, our money market, our bond market, our equity market went into a dizzy. But in India, there was dismay, denial, disbelief about why we should be affected by the crisis. The narrative or the story was that it is the Western banks, banks in America and Europe, which sinned, which indulged in excesses, toxic assets, subprime lending, etc. But our banks were well behaved, our regulators were vigilant. So why should we be having a crisis? So the story that developed was that by rights we should not be hit by this crisis, but this new governor came and brought on the crisis. So everywhere I went, around the country or around the world, people would ask me, "Sir, when would the crisis be over?" As if I knew. Nobody on the planet had an answer to that question. But since they would ask me, I would say, since you people thought that I brought on the crisis, the crisis would end when my term is over. And for good measure, I used to tell them when my term would be over. But here's the thing. The week after I left the Reserve Bank of India, the crisis ended. For 5 years, I was in the Reserve Bank. There was one crisis after another: global financial crisis, Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, a stubborn inflation crisis, a rupee tantrum crisis. But the week after that, the crisis ended, growth started going up, inflation started coming down, rupee became stable, and we went back to a path of stability. So that was, if there's one prophecy that I wish I was wrong on, that was it, but that was not my lot. A baptism by fire for me. So over the next 2 months, several months actually, we did a number of things to minimize the impact of the crisis on the Indian economy. In the event, we recovered from the crisis sooner than most other countries, including most other emerging economies.
That is very interesting, and that now I'm about to hit the 1 hour mark, and I'm very conversant of the time that I've sought from you. So I'm going to now last two questions before I open it up. There is a section in the book when you write about the JPC of 2G, the 2G scam. You, in that particular thing, and I'm trying to get it from my memory, so if I'm wrong, sorry about that. But you feel that you transition from being a hero to a villain who had let down the interests of, or failed to secure the interests of the government.
Right.
And you kind of expand upon it. And before that, there is the whole section about presumptive losses. You write about Mr. Vinod Rai, the CAG, so on and so forth. I would want to understand why would you think that, first? And second, presumptive losses is a very Government of India mechanism, if I might add, because why should that be a resource from which the government decides to make money?
Okay. Thank you for asking that question, because it connects to an earlier part of our conversation about the role of civil servants and advising the government. You asked that, if you recall. So this question actually connects with that. This is about the 2G scam of 2010, when the Department of Telecom decided that they must award more licenses in every telecom circle in the country in order to encourage competition. There was consensus on that. Everybody in the government agreed, and they consulted TRI, and TRI said that yes, give more licenses, but give it, this I'm talking about 2008, but give it at the same price as licenses were given in 2001 in order to ensure fair competition. So when that issue came to the finance ministry, and I was finance secretary at that time, I took the view that it is inappropriate to give licenses or to give spectrum away in 2008 at a price discovered in 2001. We must rediscover the price through a fresh auction. Department of Telecom pushed back against the suggestion. I believe they had good reasons for it. Their reason was that we want to give 2G spectrum at a low price so that telecom operators pass on that benefit to the customers, and prices will be low and telecom penetration will improve. That will add to efficiency and energy in the economy. That was their reason. But I persisted with my view, saying that between 2001 and 2008, all around the world, including in India, we realized that the spectrum is a scarcer commodity than we earlier believed. Therefore, part of the scarcity premium must accrue to the government. Even as the stalemate was unresolved, Department of Telecom went ahead and gave away licenses. And there were some irregularities or alleged irregularities in the licensing process that became the subject matter of a criminal case. I was not, or the Ministry of Finance was not part of that. I'm not talking about that story. I'm talking about the price at which 2G spectrum was given. So it was given away at the 2001 price. And a few months after that, some of the telecom licensees sold equity to foreign investors. and they sold the equity at an enormous premium. The inference was that they got spectrum at a low price because that the premium their share commanded was a result of the low price of the spectrum. So that story acquired momentum, that narrative acquired strength, and everybody started talking about the media first and politicians and opposition, etc. So it very soon the government lost control of the narrative and the episode took on scandal dimensions. Among the many allegations against the government at that time was that it did not heed the advice of its own finance secretary and went against it and gave it away at 2001 price. So that went on, and then a year after that, I moved on to the Reserve Bank of India. But this episode continued to haunt me even as I went to the Reserve Bank. I was called before the JPC, before the Parliament Standing Committee, before the CBI judge inquiring into it, etc., etc. So when I was called before the JPC, I went in believing that they would treat me like a hero because I was the finance secretary who said that the price must be rediscovered, government must earn more revenue, and that they would laud me for it. Instead, their entire grilling was, okay, you gave that advice, but why did you not persist with it? Why did you give up? This is in reference to your earlier question, okay, what I'm going to say now. What I said was, sir, I'm a civil servant. My responsibility, my duty is to advise. I have advised. But the government has decided to do something else. What the government has decided to do is not illegal, not irregular. A democratically elected government has the freedom to decide like that. So there's a point beyond which I cannot press my suggestion because it was not illegal, irregular. They can do whatever they want, provided it's not illegal or irregular. But the JPC refused to be convinced about that. And therefore, after about 2.5 hours of grilling, by the time I came out of the JPC meeting, I felt like a villain. I went in thinking that I would be a hero, but by the time I came out, I felt like a villain. The second part of your question is about presumptive loss. You know, the crux of the CAG's audit was that the government incurred a presumptive loss and the CAG quantified it. My position that I took in the JPC as well as in the CBI court was that it is misleading to call it a presumptive loss. If a democratically elected government decides it is not loss of revenue, it is sacrifice of revenue. If a democratically elected government decides to sacrifice revenue in order to promote a public good, the public good in this case being penetration of telecom, there's nothing wrong with it. If you allow, if you believe that, or if you agree, or if you think that it is within the purview of the CAG to go into presumptive loss, then the CAG can go into every tax concession given by the government and call it a presumptive loss. For example, the government cut corporate tax from whatever, 35% to 25%. The CAG can say this is presumptive loss. So I believe that the prerogative of the CAG to go into an issue like the prerogative loss is questionable. Presumptive loss, excuse me. Presumptive loss is questionable.
Right. There are multiple things that I would want to ask, but perhaps that is to be left for a later date.
You asked me a lot of wonderful things. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a last question, then get a comment from you, and then open it up to people who would want to ask you questions. But I am going to limit it. So that is going to be my promise. 2 weeks ago, you've given a speech, sir. It's called Shifts in Economic Influence, A New World Order. Something to do with the Chartered Financial Analyst conference that happened perhaps in Mumbai. There are many, many things in that where I can get into, but I'm going to focus on one thing that you said from the middle part going towards the end part. You talk about the 1991 interest hike, and you talk about clear communication and commitment to economic policy. While you're ending this particular comment of the, trying to keep economic policy clear and cogent, You talk about the concerns about India's economic policy, including large foreign exchange reserves and hidden expenditures, and the implications of government freebies. I would like to actually understand this. And I think you also raised this thing about RBI's role in managing the exchange rate. Are we, in a version, becoming the Japanese Meiji, the infamous Ministry of Trade in 1980s, which would constantly try and play around with the exchange rate to make an export-oriented economy?
No, I think comparison between the Meiji of the 1970s and 1980s of Japan and today's RBI or today's central banks of emerging economies is not an exact comparison because the world has changed a lot. There is enormous financial globalization. Most exchange rates are flexible. So I think the Meiji comparison is a bit misleading. But specifically about the RBI's exchange rate policy, I had some reservations about that, especially about RBI, whether it is walking the talk. I wrote about that in my previous book, Who Moved My Interest Rate. In fact, I refer to that even in this book as well, which is that should the RBI, should be the RBI policy on exchange rate and how should it be implementing it? The RBI stated policy today is that it does not target any specific exchange rate. It does not control movement of the exchange rate. It intervenes in the market only to control volatility in the exchange rate. In other words, they're not trying to change the trajectory of movement. They're only trying to change the specific shape of the movement. The end point, the starting point, end point, they're not going to change, but the trajectory of movement is something they're trying to engineer. That is the policy. But usually it is difficult from RBI's actions to agree that their actions are consistent with the stated policy. I have some reservations about RBI policy. First is that if your policy is to control volatility, you have an obligation to define volatility. You don't do that. So every time you intervene by inference, you're saying that there is volatility. The second is every time RBI intervenes in the market, there are some segments of the economy which are benefited, some segments of the economy which are hurt. For example, if the RBI tries to prevent appreciation of the rupee, for example, exporters benefit, but importers pay the cost. So should RBI be doing this? And my most important reservation against the policy is that if every time the exchange rate moves, the RBI intervenes in the market participants would simply outsource their risk management to the RBI. They know that they're protected, and that's a moral hazard. So I had these reservations while I was in the RBI. I used to discuss with my senior management. I could not reform it much, and subsequently I wrote about it. So now that I'm outside, I'm trying to generate a debate on this. That's the gist of my take on the RBI's exchange rate policy.
Right. As I promised, this was my last question. There are multiple that I want to ask, but I'm going to respect the time. I would want a comment from you and for everybody listening in, please post your questions in the comment box. I will take it up. Raghav, once this comment is over, can we have the members of the board on the screen, please, should they want to ask a question? So in answer to my first question, when I asked you to kind of help students think through diverse career choices, you said something very interesting about following your dharma. You end the book, Just a Mercenary, by writing a letter to your mother. And there is a extract where you talk about how your parents have always tried to tell you to kind of follow your dharma, but you end that particular thing by saying that in a lot of situations, you could not even find out what your dharma was. So your comment, please, on how can young students find their dharma?
Yeah, that is a semi-philosophical, if not a philosophical question. But students or youngsters, I'm sure that they're sharp enough to appreciate this better than I do. But I was in that letter to my late mother. I tried to expand on the question of following a dharma and the difficulties of following a dharma. And I go back to the Mahabharata. There are instances when your dharma is very clear. For example, when Draupadi was being disrobed in the open assembly, okay, there was one question of dharma. Take another instance when Kunti, the mother of Pandavas, goes to Karna just before the Mahabharata war and tells him that he was her firstborn son and that he must defect to the side of the Pandavas and fight for them. There, I believe that Karna's dharma was very clear to him. That's what he told Kunti. That, yes, you told me. He was irritated, annoyed with her, angry with her for hiding that. But he said, okay, you told me, but defecting is out of the question. My dharma is to be with the Kauravas. I'm going to fight with them. There, the dharma was absolutely clear. But go back to that instance of Draupadi being disrobed. And Bhishma kept silent. And he was torn he was conflicted about what his dharma was. Was his dharma to stand up and prevent or stop this disrobing of Draupadi? Or was his dharma to continue his abiding loyalty to the king and say that the king has ordered this and it must be done? He was conflicted by what his dharma was. He could not decide. So now that we're running out of time, but I can think of many instances in my own career when dharma was clear to me, what I should do was clear to me. It is a different matter that following your dharma is difficult. But what is dharma is clear. But there were also instances when it is not clear what your dharma was, and you have to struggle. And just because these are students, I'd encourage them to Google this. You probably know about yourself. There is this trolley problem, trolley, Trolley, trolley problem. You Google that. It's a very interesting philosophical question about what your dharma is. How do you make a choice? So it's quite fascinating to read that trolley problem.
It is. Michael Sandel has a whole lecture on it,
Yeah.
A Theory of Justice.
Theory of
at Harvard.
Justice.
So the first question is from my young colleague Farheen. She works on behavioral economics. She thanks you for an informational session. And in your view, how does the public's perception of the RBI's policy, such as its interest rate decisions, influence the effectiveness of these policies? And how can the RBI better manage and influence these perceptions? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question because inflation management, which is the core mandate of the Reserve Bank, is a function of several variables, including inflation expectations. For example, if people believe that inflation is going to be high, they can actually materialize high inflation. That is why central banks, including the Reserve Bank of India, do something called an inflation expectation survey. So perceptions about inflation are very important to managing inflation. That is the first part of my answer. That's my answer to the first part of the question. The second part is, in fact, a significant message of my book, which is that all public institutions, including the government and including central banks, such as the Reserve Bank of India, must make more extensive efforts to disseminate their policy. It is not enough that they decide on something and put out a statement on the website and the governor or the finance minister gives a press interview. That is necessary but not sufficient. It is very, very important to transform those documents which are written in technical language, in officialese, to lighter language, in language that people can understand, to disseminate why they have done something, what impact it will have, and what the central bank or the government will do if the outcome, depending on how the outcomes evolve. I think that is very important. And that's what governments and central banks must do. In fact, I must also say that the Bank of England, you go to the Bank of England website, they've started a new experiment of the senior management of the Bank of England going to small towns in the UK, holding meetings in the local pubs or local town halls with people, talking to them in plain English at a local level, at a person to person level. So I think there is need for the government and the central bank to do this in order to manage perceptions, because that will improve, number one, the effectiveness of public policy, and number two, the demand for accountability.
Right. So I have a second question, and I have 3 minutes to go. So I'm keeping exactly on time, as I promised. I think if there are any questions from the board, then of course my timeline doesn't follow. We are also joined by Ms. Sandhya Vasudevan, who's actually incidentally taking a flight and still listening to you. So my colleague Orko, who works in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Bangladesh, has a question about how long do you think it will take for the rupee to become a major global currency?
Well, a major global currency is not defined so, but I'm trying to put some substance or some definition of that. Major global currency is like you want the rupee to be at par with, let's say, currencies in the SDR basket, like the US dollar, the British pound, the euro, or the Japanese yen, or more recently, the Chinese yuan. You want the rupee to be like that. It'll take a long time, in my view, okay? Because we must learn from the Chinese experience. The Chinese have been trying for the last 15 years to internationalize the RMB. They've largely succeeded. Just like a domestic currency, even an international currency has three uses. It's a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. I think China has largely succeeded in making the RMB a unit of account, in the sense that much of Chinese trade is invoiced in the yuan. They've been largely successful in making the yuan a medium of exchange, in the sense that much of Chinese trade is settled in the yuan. But China has not been successful in making the yuan a store of value, in the sense that most central bank reserves are not yet invested in the yuan. And that's largely why is China successful in the first two things and not in the third? It's because China has a large global trade footprint. So China is able to command the yuan to be used as a unit of account and a medium of exchange. But China is not able to get people to invest in the yuan because Chinese institutions of governance do not inspire confidence. The yuan is not a convertible currency. The PBOC, the People's Bank of China, is not an independent central bank. Most people think of it as a separate department of the Ministry of Finance. So we take that to the Indian experience. Our trade footprint is small. In fact, India accounts, if you put our imports and exports together, it must be less than 10% of GDP. So the necessary condition, the first necessary condition, is that our trade footprint must expand. The rupee must, our financial sector must be more robust. Our fiscal must be more robust. We should be, our institutions of governance should command greater credibility. So this is a long haul. So I don't think it can be accomplished in the next 2 months or even 2 years or even 5 years, but it is a journey that is a 1,000-step journey. And as Mao said, it's got to start with the first step.
Right. Thank you, sir. This is the last question. If there are no questions from the board, that is. My colleague Abhilasha asked, how would you reflect on your tenure as the RBI governor? What stands out for you, most significant achievements or contributions?
It's difficult for me to make an introspection, much less in the public, because it is for people to make an evaluation. I can write my own report card, very embellished report card, but that won't have any credibility. So I think it's for people to evaluate my contribution, my failures. I've had my share of failures, setbacks. I had a lot of learning to do. I was on a steep learning curve, but hopefully I had contributed to. And I wouldn't say my accomplishments, But my objectives, among my objectives when I went into the Reserve Bank was among many objectives, but among them was demystifying the Reserve Bank. Trying to make the larger public understand what the Reserve Bank does and what impact it has on people's everyday lives. That's one of the things that I pushed. I pushed financial inclusion and financial literacy. I tried to bring more transparency and predictability into RBI policies. But as far as results are concerned, it's a matter for public judgment, including for that. What's her name? Who asked Sandhya? Who asked that question? For that girl.
Abhilasha.
Abhilasha.
Abhilasha and Farheen.
It's for Abhilasha to read my books and go through my career and make an evaluation herself.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for doing this. It's been an enlightening conversation for me. I've learned a lot. Hopefully, it was not a wasted conversation for you. We tried to keep it as fresh as we could. And I think I've learned a lot. That's all I can say. I don't know if there are any comments from our chair and Mr. Nag.
All I'll say is, Subba, thank you. Brilliant as always. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Najib. Wonderful reconnecting with you.